They tied her to the post for her father's sins, why? But no one expected the stranger who stepped. The frontier town of Dry Creek was built from dust, sweat, and hunger. Its main street stretched like a scar across the plain, lined with weathered storefronts and false front saloons whose paint had long since surrendered to the sun. Horses shifted restlessly at the hitching posts, tails swatting at flies while men in wide-brimmed hats leaned against railings, chewing tobacco and watching the day pass as though time itself owed them nothing. It was the sort of town where silence carried weight, and where the wind, sharp with grit, did most of the talking. At the center of the square stood a rough-hewn post, scarred from years of use, though not for tethering horses. That day, the post bore a different burden. Clara Hale, daughter of the town drunk, stood bound there with a length of coarse rope biting into her wrists. The sheriff, a man too weary to question custom and too proud to question justice, had tied her there himself, though the real crime was her father's, not hers. Her father had disappeared into a saloon not 30 paces away, leaving Clara behind as though she were less than a shadow. He had owed debts, broken promises, cursed too loud one night too many, and in the twisted logic of the town, shame fell not upon him, but upon his blood. His daughter was made to bear the punishment. Clara stood tall, or as tall as her trembling legs would allow. Her dress was plain and patched, the hem torn from years of walking dusty trails. A cold wind rushed down the street, carrying the smell of horses, sweat, and spilled whiskey. It lifted her dark hair, unraveling the braid her mother had once taught her to weave each morning, a braid that, since her mother's death, she still knotted by habit, though the ritual felt more like a memory fading with each season. People passed her without words. Some offered fleeting looks of pity. Most turned away, and a few let their eyes linger with something colder, judgment sharpened by gossip. Children peered from behind their mother's skirts, whispering as though she were a creature in a cage. Clara's lips were dry, cracked from the wind. Her throat ached for water, though none was offered. She bowed her head, wishing the ground might swallow her whole. From the outskirts of town, a lone rider approached. His horse was a broad-chested bay, dust clinging to its mane, its gait steady and unhurried. The man in the saddle wore a wide hat that shadowed his face, his coat marked by years of hard living. Ethan Mercer was his name, a rancher whose spread lay miles beyond the edge of town, where the grass grew wild and neighbors were scarce. Men in town knew him as the sort who kept his distance. He came only for supplies, coffee, nails, a sack, of flour. Few had heard him speak more than a word or two. Years ago, he had buried both wife and child in a snowstorm that refused to loosen its grip. Since then, his silence had been his shield, solitude his only companion. Yet as Ethan entered the square that day, his gaze fixed on Clara. He drew his horse to a halt, the leather saddle creaking, and studied her with the quiet disapproval of a man who had seen cruelty dressed as justice one time too many. The sight struck something deep within him, a mirror, a memory. Abandonment wore many faces, but it always carried the same weight in the eyes. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching on gravel. The townsfolk watched him with mild curiosity, though none spoke. Ethan's hand brushed the worn leather of his saddlebag, fingers hesitating as though weighing whether to intervene. He had told himself long ago he would not carry the world's grief upon his shoulders. Yet here was grief bound to a post, silent, unresisting, shamed for the sins of another. Ethan stepped forward, his presence as quiet as the falling dust. Clara lifted her head, startled by the shadow that stretched across her feet. For a moment she thought he might be another man come to laugh or scorn, but instead he knelt, setting down a wrapped loaf of bread and a small flask of water at her feet. His movements were unhurried, deliberate as though offering not charity but respect. Their eyes met, hers wide with disbelief, his steady, unreadable. In that fleeting moment, Clara felt seen in a way she had not since her mother's passing. No words passed between them, yet something unspoken did, a thread of mercy stitched into the silence. Ethan straightened, adjusted his hat, and without waiting for thanks, turned back to his horse. He mounted with the ease of habit, the leather reins fitting his grip like an old prayer. As he rode on, the square returned to its rhythm of gossip and indifference, but the moment lingered like a spark refusing to die. Clara lowered her gaze to the bread, her throat tightening. She wanted to cry, but tears had long since dried into dust. Instead, she drew a slow breath and lifted her chin just enough to see the horizon where the rancher's figure dwindled. The shame of the rope remained, but the weight of it felt, if only by a fraction, less crushing. By dusk, the sheriff would untie her, the rope leaving angry welts on her wrists. By nightfall, her father would stumble home reeking of whiskey, never asking where she had been. But in her heart, something small had shifted, like a seed pressed into dry earth. Perhaps, she thought, she was not as invisible as the town had made her believe. And Ethan Mercer, riding home to his silent ranch, told himself it was nothing. Just a loaf of bread, just a flask of water. Yet he carried the image of her eyes with him, as though some old wound had been stirred, and silence would no longer be the shield it once was. The sun sank behind the jagged hills in a haze of copper and ash, leaving the town of Dry Creek cloaked in long shadows. The sheriff untied Clara's wrists at dusk, the rope falling away with a careless flick of his hand. Her skin bore angry red marks, raw against the cool evening air. He offered no words, no apology, only a muttered warning to keep her father in line, as if the sins of a man could be steered by the broken will of his daughter. The townsfolk drifted homeward, shutters drawn, lamps lit. No one walked beside her. Clara moved with stiff steps, her head bowed, clutching the loaf of bread she had guarded all afternoon as though it were more precious than silver. Behind her, laughter spilled from the saloon doors, her father's voice among it, loud, careless, a man drunk enough to forget he had left his child tied like a thief in the square. The road to the edge of town was little more than a trail of dust, lined with scrub and the remnants of old wagon wheels discarded years before. Clara's shack stood there, leaning against the wind as though one more season might finally push it to the ground. The roof sagged, patched with tar and timber scavenged from neighbors' mercy. A lantern burned faintly in the window, though. Its light revealed nothing more than despair. Inside, her father lay sprawled on the cot, boots muddy, breath sour with whiskey. He had not noticed her absence. His chest rose and fell with a rhythm too steady to suggest guilt, too careless to suggest love. She paused in the doorway, bread clutched to her chest, and felt the familiar ache of being both child and caretaker, though she belonged fully to neither role anymore. Her eyes drifted to the corner where her mother's funeral dress remained folded in an old cedar chest. It had been white once, though dust and years had dimmed it to the color of ashes. Beside it lay a few relics of childhood, dolls stitched from rags, their button eyes loose, hair of frayed yarn tangled like forgotten prayers. Tools rusted in. The yard beyond the window, a plow blade cracked, a hammer missing its handle, relics of work left undone. Everywhere she looked, shadows clung. Not only the shadows of the setting sun, but the shadows of memory. Her mother's gentle voice, her father's laughter before whiskey had drowned it, her own laughter when the world had once seemed wide and full of promise. Now the walls whispered, with ghosts. She set the bread aside, too hollow inside to eat, and slipped back into the twilight. Her feet carried her down the path toward the river, a narrow vein of silver under the rising moon. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of whetstone and sage. Clara knelt at the bank, the hem of her dress gathering dew, and whispered to the water as if it could carry her words to her mother. "Am I more than what they say?" she breathed, her voice breaking against the current. "Am I doomed to his shame? Or do you still see me?" No answer came but the ripple of water against stone. Yet in the act of speaking, she felt her chest loosen. A spark, small, fragile but undeniable, flared inside her. She had survived another day. Perhaps tomorrow she would survive again. Far from town, Ethan Mercer rode into the hollow of his ranch. The land stretched wide and empty, fenced with cedar posts he had driven alone, fields patched with grass that waved like the restless sea, His cabin stood in the heart of it, sturdy, plain, each board shaped by his own hands. It was a house built for a family that no longer lived. He dismounted, loosening the cinch strap, letting his horse graze. The quiet was heavy, broken only by the creak of the windmill and the distant cry of a coyote. He entered his cabin, struck a match, and lit the lamp. The yellow glow revealed neatness born not of comfort, but of ritual. Every tool in its place, every corner swept clean, every absence carefully preserved. A rocking chair stood by the fire, unmoving, its seat worn smooth by a woman's touch, long gone. Ethan stared at it for a moment, the way a man stares at a wound he knows will never fully close. He brewed coffee out of habit, though its bitterness no longer warmed him. The rifle rested above the hearth, polished though untouched. A vow of silence he had made the day fever stole his wife and child. He had sworn never again to raise it unless forced, never again to let violence define his days. Yet when he had stood in the square and seen Clara tied like a criminal, something had stirred within him, not rage, but a heavy ache he could not quiet. The bread he had left her lingered in his thoughts. A simple act, nothing more, yet it weighed on him like a stone in his pocket. He told himself it was foolish sentiment. Still, when he stepped out into the night and stood at his fence line staring toward the faint glow of town in the distance, the image of her eyes would not leave him. They had been eyes full of silence, yet holding a question he did not know how to answer. The night deepened. Clara sat by the river, tracing the patterns of stars on the water's surface. Ethan leaned against the fence, arms folded, the land stretching endless before him. Though they were miles apart, the silence they shared was the same silence, the silence of wounds unspoken, of lives broken but not wholly destroyed. Both wondered in their separate places whether life had already written their endings, or whether some unwritten chapter waited still. Neither knew the answer. Yet in the hush of the night, in the whisper of river water and the groan of fence posts, a question lingered like smoke in the air. Could there still be a second chance? Hidden, in the quiet spaces where pain and mercy meet, the plains had a way of announcing their storms before they arrived. The horizon darkened first, clouds boiling up from the west, their edges bruised with purple. Then came the wind, sharp and restless, tearing through the grasses until the land itself seemed to shiver. Dry Creek felt it in the creak of shutters, in the hurried steps of women pulling laundry from the lines, in the uneasy toss of horses at the hitching rails. By afternoon, thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, rattling the windows of the mercantile. Clara Hale stood inside, clutching a folded list in her hand. Her father had scrawled it in a drunken haze that morning: flour, tobacco, a bottle of cheap whiskey if they would give it. He had pressed the paper into her palm and sent her off with no coin, no care. Only the hollow promise that the shopkeeper would extend him credit one more time. The man behind the counter shook his head before she even opened her mouth. "Not this time, Clara," he muttered, busying himself with jars and scales. "Your father's debt is deeper than the river. I can't carry it further." Clara lowered her eyes, ashamed, though the fault was not hers. The list crumpled in her hand. She turned away, stepping into the street just as the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold. Within moments, the heavens split open. Rain came down in sheets, soaking her dress, plastering hair against her face. Wind tore at her shawl, pulling it loose, but she clung to it, huddling against the wall of the livery stable for shelter. Doors slammed across the street. Windows shuttered tight. Townsfolk hurried inside, their voices muffled by the roar of rain. No one offered her space by their hearth. No one called her name. She stood alone, shivering, the mud rising around her shoes, the storm pressing down as if the sky itself sought to drive her into the earth. Through the curtain of rain came the sound of hooves. A horse rounded the corner, its rider hunched against the downpour, hat pulled low. The bay was lathered with sweat, mane tangled with water, yet its stride was steady. Ethan Mercer reined it in when he caught sight of her, a slight figure clutching a sodden shawl beneath the stable's overhang. He dismounted without a word, his boots sinking into mud. For a moment he studied her, rain streaming off the brim of his hat. Clara lowered her eyes, bracing for dismissal or judgment. Instead, he extended a hand. The gesture was simple, unspoken, but firm. She hesitated, then placed her cold fingers in his. Ethan lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain, settling her carefully against the saddle. He swung up behind her, his coat pulled wide to shield her from the worst of the storm. They rode out of town, hooves striking mud, lightning tearing across the sky. Clara clutched the saddle horn, her body trembling not only from the cold, but from the strangeness of safety, something she had not felt in years. Ethan said nothing. He guided the horse with steady hands, the kind of silence that spoke louder than comfort. By the time they reached his ranch, the storm had grown into a beast. The cabin appeared through sheets of rain, its lamp glowing faintly in the window, like a promise. He helped her down, led her inside, and shut the storm behind the heavy oak door. The fire in the hearth hissed and spat, struggling against the damp air. Ethan added logs until the flames rose steady, golden light chasing shadows from the room. Clara stood dripping near the threshold, shivering, her hands clasped tightly at her chest. He gestured toward the hearth, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. "Sit." She obeyed, sinking into a chair near the fire. He fetched a blanket, wool, and heavy, and draped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, the warmth seeping in slowly like dawn breaking through fog. She clutched it close, her eyes fixed on the flames as steam rose from her sodden dress. Ethan moved about the cabin with practiced motions. He hung her shawl and dress near the fire to dry, set a pot of water on the stove, ground coffee beans, by hand. The rich, bitter scent filled the room, blending with smoke and damp wool. His every action was deliberate, unhurried, the rhythm of a man who had learned to live in silence. Clara's gaze wandered as she warmed. The cabin walls bore the marks of labor. Old tools polished smooth by use, ropes coiled neatly, saddles oiled and hung with care. Yet in the corner stood a cedar chest, its lid closed tight. A scrap of fabric peeked from its seam, lace yellowed with age. She realized with a pang that it was a wedding dress, untouched yet preserved. Her eyes lingered there too long. Ethan noticed. His hand faltered on the coffee pot before he turned away, pouring the dark liquid into 2 mugs. He set one before her without comment. She accepted it, cradling the warmth against her palms, though she dared not drink right away. The storm raged outside, wind rattling the shutters, rain drumming on the roof. Inside, only the crackle of fire and the faint clink of ceramic filled the air. They spoke no words, yet the silence between them grew into something fragile but real. A bridge, a space where judgment held no place, where shame could not follow. Clara sipped the coffee. Its bitterness startled her, yet warmth spread through her chest. She glanced up, finding Ethan watching her from the hearth's edge. His expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the firelight, but she felt no threat there, only a weight, as though he carried storms of his own. For years she had lived unseen, a ghost in her father's shadow. Now in the heart of a storm, she was seen not with pity, nor with contempt, but with a quiet recognition that unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. And Ethan, standing silent, felt the echo of something he thought buried, a tenderness long, locked away, now stirred by the presence of a girl wrapped in his blanket, her eyes reflecting both fear and fragile hope. It terrified him, for it was easier to live in solitude than to risk feeling again. Yet the storm outside mirrored the storm within, and he knew already that nothing would be the same. The storm did not pass quickly. It lingered as though the sky itself had chosen to wash the earth clean before loosening its hold. Days of rain turned the roads to rivers of mud, made the air thick with damp, and kept the cabin isolated from the outside world. For Clara, each sunrise and sunset within Ethan Mercer's walls became a strange blend of burden and sanctuary. She rose early, often before Ethan stirred, and sought out small labors to make herself useful. She mended his shirts with neat, careful stitches as though each thread were a defense against the shame that clung to her. She swept the floor, coaxed fire back to life, fed the horses with a gentleness that steadied even the restless gelding in the corral. In every task she moved with quiet determination, as if proving herself not to Ethan, who had asked nothing of her, but to some invisible jury that had long ago declared her worthless. Ethan watched her from the edges of his silence. He had expected awkwardness, resentment, perhaps even complaints, but never this calm, industrious presence. She filled the spaces of his cabin not with chatter but with motion, her small frame carrying water buckets, her hands red from scrubbing. At night, when he glanced across the firelight, he sometimes caught her posture softened, not the posture of a servant but of someone slowly finding her footing on ground that no longer shifted beneath her. Yet the silence between them grew. Tatker, Ethan kept his words spare, his past locked behind eyes that gave nothing away. Clara, for her part, spoke little of her father, little of her years alone. It was as though both carried scars too tender to be prodded, too deep to be named. Still, unspoken questions hung in the air. Who had he once loved? Why did he live so far apart from the world? Did she believe she deserved this brief kindness? Or was she waiting for it to vanish like a dream? The nights were the hardest. The storm rattled the shutters, rain drummed steady on the roof, and the firelight flickered across faces half hidden in shadow. Clara would sit curled in the chair by the hearth, the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the flames. Ethan would lean against the mantel or sit in his rocker, arms crossed, the silence between them broken only by the pop of sap in the fire. Words hovered, unspoken, as though each feared the sound of their own voice might shatter the fragile balance. It was during one such evening that Ethan learned the storm would not wash away every danger. A trader had come through the flooded road, stopping at the ranch's edge for water. In the exchange of news, Ethan heard what chilled him. Clara's father had been grumbling in the saloon, vowing to fetch his daughter back as soon as the skies cleared. Debts had gone unpaid, cards had been lost, and the man claimed Clara was his last bargaining chip to hold against the town's creditors. The words burned in Ethan's mind long after the trader rode off. He did not tell Clara immediately, though. The knowledge weighed heavy in his chest. A fierce anger stirred in him, an anger not wild or reckless but cold, protective, steady as iron drawn from the forge. He had sworn long ago to live quietly, to let the world do as it pleased beyond his fence line. Yet the thought of that girl, who swept his floor and mended his shirts with such quiet dignity, being dragged back into scorn by a father who had never lifted a hand to shield her, it was unbearable. That night he sat across from Clara in the fire's glow, studying the way her face softened in the light, the braid over her shoulder unraveling from the day's labors. He masked his thoughts, but his jaw was tight, his hands restless. Clara sensed it. She had lived long enough under a drunkard's roof to read the weight of unspoken tempers, though Ethan's was of a different kind. It was not cruelty she felt, in him, but restraint, like a storm held behind a dam. She lowered her eyes, torn between gratitude and the ache of unworthiness. No one had ever guarded her before. To think this man might, in his silence, was both a balm and a wound. Did she deserve such shelter? Or was she merely borrowing warmth from a fire that would one day burn out and leave her in the cold again? Still, she rose, cleared the cups, and swept the hearth with quiet dignity. She would not weep. She would not cling. She would stand, even if no one else stood with her. When she finally bid him good night, retreating to the small cot he had set near the kitchen corner, Ethan remained by the fire long after. His gaze lingered on the rifle above the mantel, the weapon he had sworn not to use again. His hands flexed at his sides, remembering its weight. He thought of the snowstorm years ago, of the graves he had dug, of the vow he had made never to invite death back into his home. Yet here was a different vow, forming unspoken in his chest. If her father came, if the town turned again against her, he would not stand silent. The rain softened toward morning, a sign the storm was losing its hold. The mud would dry soon, the roads firm again. With that knowledge came the promise of confrontation. Ethan felt it in his bones, in the restless way his horse stamped in the barn, in the way Clara's eyes flickered each time thunder rolled, half expecting the world to close in again. But for now, the cabin still stood as a fragile island, the storm outside a wall that kept the world at bay. Within it, silence was both their shield and their burden. They did not speak of the road clearing, nor of debts owed, nor of the shadows that lingered beyond the walls. Yet each carried the knowledge that the storm could not last forever, and when it broke, so too would the stillness between them. The storm eased at last. For days it had hammered the land with wind and rain, but by the fourth morning the skies began to clear, and the roads hardened again. The prairie, washed clean, glistened with puddles that caught the weak sun. With the storm's retreat came the return of the world, and the threat Ethan had known would arrive. Clara rose that morning to find Ethan already outside, mending a fence post snapped in the gale. He worked with steady, deliberate movements, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes fixed on the task. She brought him a cup of coffee without a word, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. The silence between them was no longer just the quiet of two guarded souls. It was the silence of waiting. Both knew what was coming. By noon, dust rose on the horizon. Clara saw it first, her breath catching in her chest. A lone figure staggered along the road, his gait uneven, his hat askew. Even from a distance she knew him. The sagging shoulders, the swaggering tilt of his walk. The shadow of a man who had once been her protector but had long since abandoned the title. Her father. The closer he came, the more the smell of whiskey seemed to arrive before him, carried on the warming air. His boots dragged through the mud as though even the land resisted him. His eyes were bloodshot, his face unshaven, and the cruel smirk he wore told her this was no reconciliation. He had come not out of care, but of claim. Clara! His voice was rough, mocking, as though her very name were a joke. Thought you could hide yourself out here, eh? Thought you could shame me before the town? You're coming home, girl. There's debts need paying. Clara froze, the words striking her like old blows. For a moment, she was once again the child cowering in the corner, listening to bottles clatter and fists slam against wood. Her knees wavered, her lips parted, but no sound came. Then Ethan stepped forward. He came from the barn with measured strides, rifle in hand. He did not raise it, did not point it, but held it across his body with the calm authority of a man who had no need to brandish threats. His voice, when it came, was steady as the earth itself. She's not going anywhere with you. Her father blinked, then barked a laugh that turned quickly into a sneer. And who the hell are you, Mercer? Some lonely rancher playing the hero? She's my blood, my kin. You've no right to keep her. Ethan's gaze never wavered. Blood's worth nothing if it's poisoned. You've squandered every right you had the moment you chose whiskey over her. I won't see her dragged back under your roof. The tension hung thick. Clara's heart thundered in her chest, her hands gripping the folds of her dress. Her father's face twisted, half with anger, half with disbelief, as though unaccustomed to anyone daring to oppose him. He spat into the dirt, his hand twitching toward the knife at his belt. Careful, rancher, he growled. You think a gun makes you a better man? You think this girl is yours to keep? Ethan did not flinch. His finger rested not on the trigger but along the rifle's stock, his stance unmoving. She's not mine to keep. She's hers to decide. And I'll see her decision honored even if I have to drag you to the sheriff myself. It was then Clara understood. This was not Ethan's fight alone. It was hers. Trembling, she stepped forward. The rain-damp earth squelched beneath her shoes as she crossed the space between them, not toward her father, but to Ethan's side. She stood there, small but unyielding, her chin lifted though her voice could not yet find words. Her father's eyes widened, disbelief flashing into rage. But what could he do? In her silence, in her refusal to plead or beg, Clara stripped him of his power. She chose, not him, not fear, She chose herself, and by standing at Ethan's side, she declared it without needing to speak. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the prairie wind. Then her father muttered something foul under his breath, a string of curses meant to wound but already hollow. He turned, stumbling back down the road, his swagger faltering as the bottle-heavy weight of his shame followed him. Within minutes, he was swallowed by distance, a shadow against the horizon. Clara's knees nearly buckled, but she did not fall. She drew in a shaky breath, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. Ethan lowered the rifle, setting it against the porch rail. He did not touch her, did not speak, but his presence was anchor enough. That night the cabin was heavy with quiet. Clara sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The release came then, sudden and overwhelming. Tears spilled, not the weak, pleading tears of a child, but the fierce flood of chains finally breaking. Her shoulders shook, her breaths came ragged, and for once she did not hide her face. Ethan remained across from her, silent. He did not offer hollow words of comfort, nor did he move to still her. He let her grief burn itself out like a fire that had long smoldered and now at last was free to blaze. His steady presence was more than any embrace. It was recognition. When the tears finally slowed, Clara lifted her face. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked, but there was strength in her expression now, a clarity she had not known before. She was no longer the girl dragged at her father's heels. She was a woman who had chosen where to stand. Dawn crept slowly across the plains the next morning, pale light spilling through the cabin's windows. The storm was gone, the air sharp and clean. Ethan stood at the fence line once more, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Clara joined him, the quiet between them changed. No longer the silence of strangers, but of two souls who had seen each other's wounds and did not turn away. It was not yet love, no thunder, no blaze of passion, but it was something fiercer, steadier, the recognition of dignity, of worth, of lives scarred but unbroken. The storm broke with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, as if the land itself had been washed clean of its grief. For days the prairie had drowned beneath rain and shadow, but now the sky stretched vast and unblemished, a pale blue expanse above rolling fields, slick with new green. Sunlight poured down in hard, honest beams, catching on puddles that shimmered like mirrors. The storm was over, and with its passing came the reckoning. Ethan saddled the horses at first light, his movement steady but taut with unspoken thought. Clara stood on the porch, the morning air sharp in her lungs. She watched him cinch the straps, check the bridles, his silence more companionable now than it had ever been. He glanced up once, eyes meeting hers, not questioning, not commanding, but offering. She gave a small nod, her hands twisting together before she steadied them at her sides. It was time to face the town. The road stretched before them in hard-packed dust, the puddles already drying beneath the rising sun. Clara rode a pace behind, Ethan at first, the way she had always walked in the shadow of others. But the prairie wind tugged at her hair, and something in her spine straightened. She urged the mare forward until she rode beside him, not behind. He didn't comment, didn't even look her way, but the faintest flicker of approval crossed his expression. When the town's rooftops came into view, Clara's stomach clenched. Memories surged. The jeering faces, the post in the square, the rough rope against her wrists, her father's drunken laughter echoing above it all. She almost faltered, almost let shame drive her back. But Ethan's steady presence held her firm. He was not leading her into that place. He was walking with her into it. The streets were busier than she expected. Word traveled faster than wagons, on the frontier, and already the whispers of Ethan Mercer standing down a drunk had reached the ears of shopkeepers and passers-by. Heads turned as they rode in, voices lowered to murmurs. Clara felt their eyes, some curious, some cautious, a few still sharp with judgment, but the weight of their stares pressed lighter than before. At the general store, Ethan dismounted first, tying his horse to the post with calm efficiency. Clara slid down from the saddle, her knees unsteady, but she forced her shoulders straight. When she stepped to Ethan's side, he made no move to shield her. He did not hurry her along or tell her to wait outside. He simply pushed open the door and walked in with her at his shoulder. Inside, the store smelled of grain and leather, lamp oil and tobacco. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, his brows lifting at the sight of Clara. For a breath, the air was thick with expectation. Then Ethan spoke. "Need flour, coffee, nails, rope?" His voice was even, practical. The clerk hesitated, his gaze flicking once to Clara, then back to Ethan. "You'll have it," he said, scribbling on a notepad. And just like that, the moment passed. Clara exhaled slowly, realizing only then she'd been holding her breath. No one jeered, no one spat, no one called her shame aloud. The silence of scorn remained, but it no longer cut so deep. When they stepped back into the sunlight, arms laden with supplies, Clara stopped short. Across the street, the market post stood as it always had, rough timber planted into the earth, its surface worn by years of sun and rain. The rope still dangled, frayed now, the knot loose, swaying gently in the breeze. Her heart thudded. That post had been her prison, her humiliation. Yet now, in the bright light of day, it looked small, weathered, almost pitiful in its emptiness. Drawn forward, Clara crossed the street. She lifted her hand, resting her palm against the wood. Splinters caught at her skin, but she did not pull away. She let herself feel the rough grain, the scars etched into it, the history that had once bound her. Then she closed her eyes and released a breath. Not in despair, but in release. She was no longer tied here. Ethan stood a few paces behind, watching, without interruption. He did not approach, did not ask what she felt. He simply let her have the moment. When Clara turned back, there was no dramatic gesture, no bold declaration, only a steadiness in her eyes, a quiet that had not been there before. She stepped away from the post, left it behind, and mounted her horse without looking back. The ride home was long and sunlit, the trail stretching golden before them. Dust rose in soft clouds beneath the horse's hooves, catching in the afternoon, light like smoke. Clara rode with her head high, her shawl tucked away in the saddlebag. For the first time, her face was uncovered, unhidden. Ethan rode close, his presence as constant as the horizon. He did not press her with words, nor did he reach to claim what was not his. But his nearness was steady, protective without suffocating. In his silence was not distance, but a promise. He would walk beside her, not over her. As the sun sank lower, the prairie stretched vast and endless around them, a world of shadows and gold. Two figures rode across it, one scarred by shame, one scarred by solitude. Yet together their silhouettes cast long and unbroken against the land. They looked less like the remnants of broken lives and more like the beginning of something new. No vows were spoken. No sudden declarations broke the quiet. What passed between them was simpler, deeper, a shared knowledge that survival had carried them this far, and now healing would carry them farther. At the edge of the horizon, where sky met earth in a blaze of fading light, Clara felt the weight she had carried so long begin to lift. Her scars were not chains. They were proof she had endured, proof she had risen. And beside her rode a man who had once built his world from silence, but who now understood that compassion, not solitude, was the truest form of strength. The trail stretched on. The wind carried their breath into the open sky. And as dusk gathered around them, two riders moved forward, not as savior and saved, not as burden and bearer, but as equals, scarred, surviving, and no longer alone.